Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Others, we're going to be starting in just a few minutes. Welcome, everybody. My name is Lara Kiswani, and I am with AROC, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. On behalf of AROC, the Red Nation, and Center for Political Education, I'd like to welcome you all to another edition of our Friday Night Forum. Friday Night Forums, it's a collaboration between AROC, CPE, and the Red Nation. It's a series of conversations on critical topics that offer us lessons for international solidarity, understanding that the COVID pandemic is global, and so our response to it must also be global. By providing anti-imperialist perspectives from around the world, we are hoping to offer our left movements here in the United States ways to be in joint struggles with those facing the brunt of US empire, with an eye towards anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles right here on Turtle Island. Be sure to join us next week as we'll be discussing Palestine and the blockade on Gaza with Usama Tanous, Noura Erakat, and Ziad Abbas. Today, we'll be live streaming our webinar on the Facebook pages of all the partner organizations. So for those who were not able to register, please encourage folks to check out the live streams for AROC, CPE, and the Red Nation. It'll also be recorded on YouTube and made available through the Red Nation's YouTube as well as the Red Nation's podcast. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by three movement scholars who have contributed to anti-war strategy, thinking, and organizing over many years. Tonight's topic is the sanctions on Iran. We understand the region of West Asia and its current geopolitics as shaped by the colonial construction of nation states. As such, we'll be situating the discussion of sanctions on Iran within a regional context. What is the history of US sanctions on Iran? The history of organizing against sanctions? How have sanctions been weaponized as a form of economic warfare in service of US empire? How have sanctions impacted the ability of those across the world to be able to respond to COVID-19? And how do sanctions on Iran provide us with an analysis of today's United States military, economic, and political foreign policy? Today, we'll have two presentations, one by Sima Shakhsari and the other by Yousef, moderated by myself and Dina Al-Adib. As always, there'll be a discussion afterwards. So during the presentations and throughout this webinar, please be sure to use the chat function if you're on Zoom. You can also use the question and answer function that's available to put any questions you have or thoughts that you'd like to be raised inside of this discussion today for the presenters. You can also do the same thing on the live streams. So I want to start us off by introducing my sister, Dina Al-Adib. Dina is a scholar, activist born in Baghdad, Iraq. She unwillingly relocated to the Bay Area during the first Gulf War in 1990 and has been involved in anti-imperialist, anti-war, anti-sanctions movements since then. She was a board member of AROC's predecessor, ADC San Francisco, as well as an active member of the Center for Political Education. Dina is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the American Studies Department at UC Davis, where she collaborates with the Critical Militarization, Policing, and Security Studies Research Group. I'm going to hand it over to Dina to move our conversation along.
Thank you, Lara. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to thank Clara, Rachel from the Center for Political Education, and Nick from Red Nation for inviting us and creating this incredible space for all of us to come together and have this conversation. It's truly an honor. I'd like to, begin this conversation with first introducing Sima Shakhsari and contextualizing Sima's commitment and long-term efforts in anti-war and anti-sanction and anti-empire movement work, not only as a scholar, but as an activist and someone who lived in the Bay Area and was very active both with ADCSF, Insight, and other organizations. And I'll talk about that in a second, but let me introduce Sima, please. So Sima Shakhsari is an associate professor in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. Their book titled Politics of Rightful Killing, Civil Society, Gender, and Sexuality in Blockade examines the role of the Iranian diaspora in internet democratization projects that claim to free Iran while subjugating the Iranian population to death through sanctions and war. Highly recommend the book. It's incredible. I haven't finished this, but I am definitely engaged. So highly recommend that you get a copy if you get a chance. So, just a little, little story that I would like to share with you. When I was an organizer with ADCSF, and also we organized in, I believe, 2000, an event at the Mission Cultural Center, and Center for Political Education was one of the co-sponsors. And Sima shared with us their beautiful poetry, and that specific event was an anti-sanctions, an Iraq anti-sanctions event. This was a movement that started in the early 90s with the U.S. international sanctions of Iraq after the first Gulf War, or actually before the first Gulf War, that lasted for 13 years. And they've been an incredible active member since then, and an ally, and have a lot of respect for Sima's long-term commitment for community organizing, for the work we do, and as a scholar and as a friend. Highly respect Sima, and so thank you, Sima, for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dina. Okay, I've just got a message on Zoom. Thank you so much, Dina, for that generous and warm introduction. I also, the respect is mutual, and I'm very happy to be in conversation with you, Yousef, and Lara today. Let me also thank the organizers, AROC, Center for Political Education, and the Red Nation, in particular, Chris, Lara, Rachel, Joseph, Nick, Yasmin, and other people who have put so much work into making this happen, and for the fantastic Friday night series that you all make possible. I live in Minneapolis on Dakota land, and I live pretty much only 6 miles away from Bedote, which is a sacred place for Dakota people, where white settlers built Fort Snelling in 19th century, and in 1862, between 1862 and 1863, thousands of Dakota and Ojibwe people were forced to march to Fort Snelling, and they were hanged or imprisoned in concentration camps, and many died from measles. So, and I also teach at the University of Minnesota, which basically is on stolen land and profits from stolen land. So I am very aware of the privileges that settler colonialism has afforded me, and I'm hoping that through our coalition building and our scholarship and activism, we can develop, as you all have, but to continue that work, to make connections between U.S. settler colonial practices and U.S. colonialism and imperialism in Southwest Asia and North Africa, and making that connection to settler colonialism in Turtle Island. So again, I'm thankful for this opportunity. And Dina mentioned our activism, in 1990s and 2000s around the sanctions on Iraq, and the sanctions on Iran seem to me that they're replicating pretty much what was done in Iraq. And back then there was an event that also Arab Women's Solidarity Association with other organizations that Dina mentioned put together, and I had the privilege of reading a poem. And this is, I believe it was in 2000 when this event happened, 1999 or 2000, and there were so many things happening. Gentrification of San Francisco was happening with the dot-com boom. It was Prop 21 and 22 were passing, and for those of you who don't remember, Prop 21 was basically increasing sentences for minor crimes for youth, and it was, of course, affecting youth of color drastically. So it was criminalizing youth of color, and Prop 22 at that point was about basically defining marriage only between a man and a woman. I'm anti-gay marriage for normalization of basically queer life and the kind of neoliberal forms of queerness that it cultivates. But at that point, we are talking about around 2000, 15 years before gay marriage became legal. So I wrote this poem, and I'm going to start with this poem and then delve into a discussion about the sanctions. The poem goes like this. Why do I write about war when we all dream of peace and halva tastes so sweet in our multicultural neighborhood cafe, congested with dot-coms and scent of chai and sound of music and delightful conversations about spiritual matters? Why do I write about war when freedom keeps the fire going yellow and red like pus and blood in a green woman's torch? Liberty watching over border in a world you say is without borders. Maybe this is not a dream or a tale of love. Maybe this is not a song for meditation or music to your ears. And no, bellies stuck to the bone cannot belly dance. Is there anything but bombs in the black eyes of the children you once captured in your National Geographic? Is there anything but death in the freedom you gift us? I still write about war, and I still yearn to write love poems. I still yearn to write love poems between bullets and blood, between detention and welfare cuts, between the sanctions and Prop 21 and 22. I still yearn to write love poems. I still love, love, love beyond your hate. Is that my third strike, America? So, like I said, this was during the time that Third Strike and You're Out, the criminalization of people of color was going on in the 90s, all the welfare reform basically measures that pushed women of color further into poverty, and all the other neoliberal policies were going into effect. So as I said, this was in particular for events about Iraq sanctions, which, as Dino mentioned, for 13 years between 1990 and 2003, the sanctions killed over 500,000 Iraqi children as a direct result of sanctions for lack of access to medicine and clean water and food. And that is, like I said, is pretty much what the US sanctions are trying to do in Iran. The sanctions in Iran are not new, of course. They started in 1979, right after the US-backed Pahlavi regime was toppled by a popular revolution. Actually, the very first time that the US and UK imposed kind of sanctions on Iran was in 1951 with the nationalization of oil under the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. And right after the nationalization, basically the US and UK stopped or prohibited the kind of purchase of oil, and that meant economic kind of decline for Iran. And instead of the oil that Iran produced at that time, basically Saudi Arabia, through BP and Aramco and also in Kuwait and Iraq, they kind of supplemented. They increased their oil production to replace the oil that was coming from Iran and no one was purchasing anymore. And just a side note that in 1953, of course, CIA organized the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restored power to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. So I was saying that 1979 was basically just quickly the first post-revolutionary Iran in 1979, the first time that sanctions were imposed on Iran, and that was because of the hostage crisis. And the US basically froze Iran's assets, something like 12 billion, I believe. And then the US Department of State designated Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism. Of course, this is immediately after the Iranian Revolution and right before the Iran-Iraq War. So after the Iran-Iraq War in 92, the US passes the Iran-Iraq Arms Non-Proliferation Act, which basically does not allow any goods or technology to Iran or Iraq with this kind of claim that this could contribute to building nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. Now, again, interestingly, in 1957, during Shah's time, the US was or had an agreement for nuclear cooperation and provided Iran with a reactor and weapon-grade enriched uranium fuel. So US was the one that gave nuclear technology to Iran during Shah's time, but after revolution, all of a sudden, Iran became a terrorist state and was not allowed to develop nuclear energy. So then in the 90s, again, we had more sanctions imposed on Iran. In 96, actually, was the Iran Sanctions Act that tried to penalize foreign investment in Iran, in particular in Iran's petroleum industry. So the sanctions did not really go into effect until Obama's time under those terms in 2010. And then in late 90s, 96, 97, under Clinton, there were more sanctions that were imposed on Iran. And then between 2007 and 2010, the UN Security Council basically imposed sanctions on Iran because of Iran's nuclear technology, claiming that Iran was developing nuclear weapons. And then in 2010, the US Congress passed the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions and Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act, CISADA. And that was one of the harshest, basically the tightening of the sanctions. And my work is with Iranian queer and trans refugee applicants in Turkey. This is a side note. And one of the things that I argue in my work is that the number of refugees that left Iran after 2010 increased substantially. And that has to do directly with the sanctions, not just Iranian queer and trans refugees, but also Afghan refugees who had lived in Iran because of the US occupation, because of the rise of Taliban, had sought basically a refuge in Iran. They left Iran for Turkey to apply for asylum, for a third country of asylum, because of the economic situation in Iran was so bad. And it, of course, affected, and it still does affect, the most vulnerable people in Iran. So then in 2011, the US basically imposed sanctions on the central bank of Iran, which is really important because even if you think medicine supposedly is not supposed to be sanctioned, but because all the transactions have to go through these financial institutions and the central bank of Iran, that means that even medicine cannot go to Iran. And that is the situation now. And that was the situation back then. So then, there were more, Europe, basically European Union stopped importing Iranian oil in 2002. And then we get to basically 2015, when we have the negotiations that started happening after the election of Hassan Rouhani between Iran and the UN and then the US. Which culminated in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is basically, the time culminates in 2015, the kind of the lifting of some of the sanctions. Some of the sanctions were not lifted, but some were. In particular, the secondary sanctions were lifted, but the primary US sanctions stayed in place. So, more commercial activity between Iran and US was still not happening. So then the so-called Iran deal, of course, with Trump after 2018, the U.S. withdrew from that, and then harsher sanctions than even before have been imposed on Iran. So this is basically a quick overview of the sanctions, and I just want to talk about the situation with the coronavirus at this point. I have two nieces who are doctors in Iranian hospitals, and I hear firsthand about how the sanctions have affected hospitals in Iran even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And that basically has a lot to do with the fact that under the sanctions, medical equipment cannot be imported to Iran. If the machines break out, with the ventilators, they cannot have people from outside the companies that sell those to or used to sell them to Iran to repair them. So even before the COVID-19, my nieces tell me that the connector tubes for these ventilator machines are supposed to be disposable and used once, but because of the sanctions, because of lack of access, they were using them over and over, sanitizing them and using them over and over, and they're only supposed to be used once. Access to machinery that washes all these medical equipment was and still is not available to Iran. So that has caused basically a catastrophe during the pandemic. The Office of, I think, the Health Minister in Iran said that every 10 minutes someone is dying in Iran from the sanctions. And of course, that the situation in the US is even worse now, and we need to make those connections, of course, that how is that also lack of access to universal health care is affecting poor people and communities of color, people on reservations, and how is that US, which is supposed to be a first world country, has so many people dying while Donald Trump is getting a corona test every day. So these are, also the medical effects are, of course, catastrophic. And this was before the before the corona too. Many people died and continue to die from cancer in Iran. And the rate of cancer has skyrocketed because of air pollution. And that air pollution has to do with the sanctions in large part because in particular after 2010, when Iran could not send its petroleum to be refined outside, the state came up with its own homegrown industries, refinery industries that produces oil that people put in their cars, or petroleum products that go in for fuel for households or in the cars, that produce 10 to 800 times more toxins than the international standards. So the air that Iranians are breathing is practically killing them, and that is why the rate of cancer has skyrocketed over the past decade or so in Iran. And there was, and there still is no access to, or very little access to, life-saving medicine. You have to buy it on the black market, and of course you have to have money to do that, and that is also very difficult to find. So the medical aspect of it is extremely devastating. How am I doing with time?
You have a few more minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. So I just want to say something quickly, and maybe after that we can come back to this conversation in Q&A. And that is the effect of sanctions on social movements. Of course, sanctions are a form of war, and during times of war, discourses of national security are very much on the rise, and any kind of dissent basically is repressed by the state because it is seen as collusion with the foreign states, in particular the US. So the legitimate protests of the Iranian people are repressed harsher by the Iranian state exactly because of the sanctions. So the sanctions are not helping the Iranian people. They're hurting the most vulnerable, the working class, children of the streets, کودکان خیابانی, کودکان کار, or refugees, single mothers, and people who are the most vulnerable in Iran. And they're not helping social movements at all. They are raising discontent, and we can talk more about that, in particular with the protests that happen in relationship to the austerity measures of the Iranian state, the rising gas prices, and the cuts in subsidies, and so on and so forth. But they're actually not helping any social movements because, like I said, people who have these legitimate concerns cannot express or cannot organize exactly because of the pressure of the sanctions and how people are, stuck between a rock and a hard place. They, on one hand, they have to deal with US imperialism and the sanctions. On the other hand, they basically have to be quiet in the face of austerity measures and other, or imprisonment and so on and so forth. So I'm going to stop here, and then maybe we can have a deeper conversation about social movements later in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sima, for that historical context. And we really appreciate you situating what's happening in Iran, both on the direct impact of people on the ground, but also historically in terms of how US empire has used economic warfare against Iran over many decades. And as I mentioned earlier, part of our goal for today is also to situate this within the regional context. And so we're really lucky and fortunate to have today with us Yousef Beckett, who's an assistant professor of international studies at California State University, Long Beach, where he's also the co-director of Middle East Studies program. He studies the political economy with a special focus on the Middle East, where he's been looking at the invasion and occupation of Iraq. He's also one of the founding members of the Iraqi Narrative Project that seeks to document the histories of Iraqi migrants, refugees, and exiles. So we're very lucky to have Yousef, who'll be presenting in a second. I just want to remind everybody to please put your questions in the chat box, and we're also live streaming on AROC, CPE, and TRN's Facebook pages in case people weren't able to register. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Yousef.
Thank you, Lara, for the introduction. And I want to first also thank Lara, Dina Ladib, Rachel Herzing, Nick Estes, Joseph Fisher, and all others who have helped to put this event together, and for inviting me to be in this conversation with all of you, and for Sima as well. I want to thank also the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, the Center for Political Education, and the Red Nation for this series. These organizations truly must be cherished more than just for their everyday work and services that they continue to provide. I think it is their continued effort to expand our collective political imaginaries that is so important in these times. So thank you for that. Overall, what I want to do initially is I want to suggest that everything you hear about the sanctions on Iran in the United States is not only false, it is the weaving of a tall tale told by the most gifted of fantasy writers, and that is the American government. Not only is this tall tale a fantasy, it is actually a projection of the inner failures, shortcomings, ugliness, destruction, and dare I say savagery projected onto the other, that is sold back to us as if it is a story of over there, trying to separate us over here from all of those living over there. I want to speak about that by making three overall points. The first is a seemingly simple and mundane point, perhaps, which is that Iran is like any other state. There are no fundamental differences between Iran and other states in the international arena. Because Iran is like any other state, then the sanctions regime is entirely illegitimate because it relies on the idea that Iran is somehow exceptional and different. The second point I want to make is about the centrality of imperialism in understanding the sanctions regime. That only by understanding imperialism can we understand why the simple point that Iran is like any other state might actually be a much more profound and important point to consider. And thirdly, given the imperialist machinations, anti-imperialism, I want to suggest, is crucial in allowing us to understand the relationship between over here and over there. Or to put it another way, why solidarity is not a strategy, but rather at the crux of what the actual solution to our current decrepit situation might be. So let me begin by making the first point. The Islamic Republic of Iran, which was founded in 1979, as Sima just gave us the history, is no different in the international arena than any other place, than any other nation state. That means theoretically, within the norms of the international arena, it is an autonomous player within a world, and it is thus subject to the rules and regulations of international law and treaties that it has signed on to, as well as being subject to accountability by the international institutions that govern or adjudicate those laws and treaties. This is important because the sanctions regime, as Sima suggested, is twofold. One, the sanctions that begin in 1979 after the Iranian revolutions, and two, then sanctions imposed on Iran after the nuclear program, starting with Resolution 1737 in December 2006. If you look into the details of both these sanctions regimes, they are predicated on the idea that Iran ought to be treated differently than other countries, that it was different, that it is not ordinary. Specifically, with regards to the sanctions on the basis of the nuclear program, Iran, you have to understand, is one of the original signatories of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. When the treaty was signed, it set up the International Atomic Energy Agency that oversaw the compliance with the NPT. It is important to note here, of course, as Vijay Prashad describes in his book, that the IAEA in itself emerges out of the calls by third world countries or the non-aligned movement at the time, who made such calls going as far, made calls for denuclearization and disarmament as far back as the 1955 Bandung Conference in Indonesia. The charge that Iran somehow transgressed the NPT was brought against Iran by the United States, specifically at the time of the Bush administration. This was the same Bush administration that famously called Iran as part of the axis of evil in the world. And that term is important here because it is about, again, putting Iran outside the community of nation states. Iran was said to be a rogue state, or one that was outside the confines of rules within the international arena. Yet Iran had not broken any international law. When the IAEA would say that Iran was in compliance with the NPT, the United States would say that the IAEA did not do a thorough enough job. when the NPT regulations say that military sites are not to be searched by the IAEA, the US would say that Iran is different, and its unwillingness to let inspectors enter its military installations is evidence of its intent to develop nuclear weapons. Again, regardless of the fact that the NPT at the time did not require that. When the IAEA then, through American pressure, would issue a statement critical of Iran, then the US would point to it as evidence of Iranian transgression of international norms. In other words, the pressure that was brought onto Iran at the time, which resulted in the July 2015 agreement between the JCPOA and Iran under the Obama administration, was fundamentally built on pressure brought on Iran based on the fact that Iran was not a normal country or an actor within the international scene. The second, then, that we admit that Iran is a normal actor, then the entirety of the sanctions regime is unveiled for what it is: illegitimate and illegal. And given that it is resulting in the misery and death of people, as Sima pointed out, especially in this current COVID-19 pandemic, it makes it a heinous criminal act propagated by the United States and aided and abetted by European states. Full stop. If we accept that Iran is a normal state like any other, a normal state could be defined, as Max Weber does, as the political entity that has monopoly on violence, then one can respond, and I assure you people will probably respond to me by arguing that, well, given Iran's ordinariness, then it should be held to account for what it does domestically, whether it's discrimination, violence, or brutality, or what it does regionally in terms of its foreign policy. In other words, what I just said, I could be accused of being an apologist for the regime. So I want to respond to that. We should first note that it is absolutely, of course, the right of people to critique, hold to account, protest, rebel, and even overthrow any government and governing elite anywhere in the world if those governments are unjust, exploitative, colonial, or settler colonial, brutal, or generally do not serve the people from whom their authority derives. It is also important for people across the world to have the right to oppose oppressive elites and their agendas throughout the world. But when it comes to the sanctions on Iran and the US foreign policy or European foreign policy towards Iran, it would be a big mistake to somehow think that this has anything to do with what Iran is doing in Iran, what the Iranian government or the Islamic Republic is doing in Iran. It would also be a big mistake to think that somehow, some way, that American foreign policy should be used to promote justice, equality, freedom, or peace anywhere in the world, unless there is a revolutionary structural adjustment to the very makeup of the American state, which we haven't seen yet. This brings me to my overall second point that I want to make, which is to understand the imperialist machinations in Iran and the broader region. First, it's important to understand that I just said that the nations, that there's this theory in which in the international arena, nation states are autonomous and they are all equal actors. That, of course, is not true, because the international arena is not an arena of equal power between autonomous states. States and states have to be understood as relational, and there is a profound asymmetry of power globally. And that profound asymmetry of power globally rests on the notion of sovereignty. That sovereignty, we somehow believe that all of these different countries are sovereign or have territorial integrity or control over their territories, and that is just absolutely not true. And that difference, there is some countries that are sovereign and actually have control over their territories, and some countries that do not. And the separation comes from colonialism. That the colonial countries had sovereignty and still have sovereignty. And the colonized countries, all of the colonized world, even if they were able to get independence, have yet to actually have sovereignty, in the sense that the international law is built on a foundation in which only countries like the United States, Canada, Western European countries, and some other few countries actually are sovereign over their territory. Everywhere else, through international law mechanisms, we allow for intrusion into and interference into the other country, into those other places. Because for all of those other places, the question is not that, are you sovereign or are you not? The question is, can you live up to have the capacity to be sovereign? And thus colonized peoples, even if they have a nation state, have to still prove that they live up to the capacity of being sovereign, something that the United States and Western Europe never has to answer to. I mean, I'll give you a quick example of this. Right now, the China, which is a powerful country, it's a powerful country militarily, economically, politically. But because of COVID-19, the United States, France, and England are making claims through which they say we need to be able to go inside of China and investigate what the Chinese government was doing when this virus hit. The opposite could never be true. It's not even legible to us to think of another country saying, hey, you know what? We need to be able to investigate what the United States government did in the United States, given what happened in New York. We need to be able to investigate what the United States policy towards COVID-19 was to see if it was responsible for the further spread of the virus. That is not even a legible question because the United States has sovereignty, whereas Chinese sovereignty over the territory is always conditional. And the Chinese state has to live up to the place where they have sovereignty. So that's one. Then in terms of the question of imperialism, we need to, I think, I want to talk about it discursively and then lay out what the objectives of imperialism is in the region. Discursively, and by discursively, I mean the conversation, the narrative, or how we know what we know about something. In the case of Iran, is in the case of Iran, is structured. So every time the US points the finger at Iran, or rather any other country, there is a strange reaction where everyone, all of us, actually looks at where America's pointing to. So America points there, we all look there. If it's pointing here, we all look there. We look at wherever the United States points to. And so every time the finger is pointed to Iran, media organizations and cultural producers begin to examine Iran, its structures, its society. You begin to see questions about inequality, social differences, government oppression, etc. Here it's crucial to understand, of course, that these examinations emanating out of cultural producers in the United States are not necessarily based on the actual place that they purport to speak about. The narrative in the US about Iran is based on a projected view of what Iran is. Those projections operate discursively to talk of Iran through constant contrasting of Iran's supposed qualities or traits to those of the United States, or of liberalism if the portrayal is a sophisticated one. And this is not difficult to see, and this was one of the central arguments that Edward Said makes throughout his work, including Orientalism. Regardless of what that the portrayal is, we then often find ourselves responding to those portrayals by attempting to humanize the place or the people of the place. We try to add nuance to the depictions of the narratives. By engaging in this debate, we allow the very idea that there is a liberal standard to which Iran must abide by in order to be treated within the laws of the international system to maintain itself. Our debate makes this facade seem real every time it is repeated. But it's hard for us not to defend the position and not to add nuance to that picture. I mean, Said says in Orientalism that part of how this discourse works is that every time you want to talk about the so-called Orient, you have to unpack what the Orient is not so that you could get to the point that the Orient is a constructed facade. And these are powerful portrayals because they're backed by money and real power. The construction of the other is a project of dehumanization. Dehumanization isn't a consequence of war. Dehumanization is intentional. The dehumanization of a place like Iran or Iraq or Native folks in this country or Black folks in this country is the discursive and affective objective. In the case of Iran, is the discursive and affective objectives of the geopolitical project in the region. To put it simply, none of the pressure we witness today against the Iranian government is actually about the Iranian government. Rather, it is about the United States and its position within global capitalism. So now I want to turn and talk about what the material operations are or what the objectives are in the region. And to answer that, we need to understand that today we live under a specific iteration of global capitalism. which is neoliberal capitalism that starts around the 1970s. And it starts in the 1970s specifically as a response to the movement of third world peoples all across the world. What Vijay Prashad calls the Third World Project, what Sohail Dalatsai calls the Muslim International. That the Third World Project was a world-making project built to counter the world that racism and white supremacy had built through colonialism and imperialism. And neoliberal capitalism then was a counter movement, a counterinsurgency, the response of the imperial and colonial powers to anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. And I could talk more about what neoliberalism did, but suffice to say, to bring it in the United States, neoliberal restructuring that was forced on everywhere in the United States led to a precipitous erosion of the social wage, meaning the welfare, the obligations that the state had to its people in terms of providing services and making sure that they are able to live within a good standard of living. The erosion of the social wage in the United States was part of the same process that opened up borders to capital and commodities. This process leads to deindustrialization in parts of the US and economic dislocation for people in the US as their jobs were relocated by transnational corporations throughout to the entire world. Under the mantra of job creation, politicians deregulated the labor market as so-called right-to-work legislations were passed in many states. Hence, if jobs ever came back, they were not unionized, they paid less, they lacked benefits, and they had less stability. In short, these were precarious jobs. As wages stagnated and lagged behind the rising cost of living, credit became the only way for people to maintain their consumption levels, so that we all became indebted to our credit because we no longer were getting paid what we used to get paid in work, or the government wouldn't support us as they used to support us. And so you could see now the repercussions of being so indebted when something like COVID-19 happens and nobody could afford their rent even within 1 week of not being able to work, that we live to work in this country. And this is the generalized condition of most people in the United States. So by the 1990s, neoliberalism restructures the world, including the United States. The everyday feeling of anxiety as precarity became the new normal in the United States, which produces a problem of legitimacy. Because at the end of the day, as states no longer provide services and no longer regulate the economy, they are asked by their population. The American government is asked by its people, what do you do? What are you good for? And here, the crucial response of the United States has been, we are here to defend liberalism from the illiberal and savage outside. The response of the United States was, we are here to defend you and to defend the borders of liberalism from the boogeyman that's starting after 1991 and the demise of the Soviet Union became Muslim. And Muslim as a racial category rather than a theological category. Muslim as those who became seen as Muslim. So that as the state retreats from the social wage, it began to speak of itself as the defender of the nation against an ever-increasing external threat. And this, I argue that this investment in the construction of the Muslim as the quintessential illiberal subject threatening the walls of liberalism and civilization is the affective wages of neoliberalism. Meaning these wages affords its subjects, people in the United States, the feeling of civilizational superiority, of being God's chosen people in an increasingly callous and dangerous world. The affective wages help displace the callousness and danger away from the neoliberal political economy and instead project it onto the Muslim other and all those other others. The fear of the Muslim then is stoked by the neoliberal state. That stoking gives it its central purpose. And that's why it is so invested in the projection that it projects onto Iran, onto Iraq, onto all these other places in the region of the stories and the narratives that it says. In this way, the United States operations in the Middle East has 4 objectives. 1, war making and reconstruction. Because war making itself has become one of the last sustainable profit sectors for capital, and specifically the United States. to the idea that there is a threat over there, a threat that could be transported to over here in the borders of the United States against every person living here, gives the American government its central purpose, like I just said. Third, it's the creation of crisis over there provides the US with the ability to constantly manage crises, enabling the racist narrative that somehow people over there are inherently violent and backwards. And fourth, to push back against resistance to the idea of transnational accumulation and American power, given that the Third World Project, part of it was centered in the very region itself. So with the resistance that emanates from places like Palestine, places like Lebanon right now, or Iraq, these are ways in which the US objectives in the region are set on making sure it could prevent and counter those types of resistance. So given the work of imperialism, I want to end by saying some words about why then anti-imperialism is so important. And here, look, like I said, dehumanization or the undermining and demotion of one's humanity is central to the political project of imperialism. But the logic there is the fundamental work of white supremacy. The notion that there is a fundamental intrinsic difference between the constructed whiteness and the other. Look, I want to, just this week, we all, I'm sure, have heard of the ruthless murder of Ahmaud Arbery, killed by a former cop and his son. The video existed of this murder, yet and the police had it, yet no one was arrested or indicted for 2 months until yesterday after a public outcry. The discourse around the case first was one in which it had to be first proven or shown that Mr. Arbery was not armed or intent on violence before he was allowed entry into the realm of a normal citizen who cannot be attacked based on suspicion by any person. That Ahmaud Arbery in death has to show that despite his blackness, he should be seen as a normal person and seen as normal, as ordinary. But Mr. Arbery is not alone in this. This is the general condition for Black folks in the United States. What makes Mr. Arbery unique is the presence of video footage, which in itself does not guarantee justice, as we saw in the case of Eric Garner, Oscar Grant III, or others. Mr. Arbery is being murdered over and over again as his inclusion into the realm of humanity and human rights supposedly guaranteed to him are questioned because of his given ontological difference of his blackness, so that he has to do double work. First, I have to assert that I am somehow equal, ordinary, and human, and then I get to enter into the legal process. So this is Mr. Arbery. We could look at the same thing in terms of currently the way that states are not recognizing the numbers of people, the number of Native people who are being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 or their disproportionate deaths. States just are not counting it. Or we could look at how Puerto Rican brothers and sisters after Hurricane Maria had to first assert, like, yo, we're American. We're within the laws of the country, we're citizen, in order to beg the American government to provide them some kind of services that any other person has. In these examples, you see that despite the level of analysis we choose, whether we look at the individual level, the community level, or zoom out at the larger national level, the logic is the same, that in order to receive the protection of and the promised benefits of liberalism or the rule of law, we must first prove our worthiness, that we must argue despite our inferiority based on our racialization or how we were raised, that despite that, we are still human. That despite that, we need to, that the laws, whether they are laws of this country or the laws of the international world, the international arena, those should still apply to us. What I'm arguing here is that imperialism has never existed without white supremacy's logic of racial superiority, that liberalism has never existed without imperialism, and thus the anti-imperialist viewpoint needs to be kind of a stepping stone, an initial step to move us forward, because our solidarity amongst us is not based on an external factor of, oh, you know what, it's strategic for us to be allies. We'll be stronger if we are allies, but rather that solidarity is because we are internally related. that our problems are internally related. We are suffering from the same thing, whether we are over here or over there, wherever over there is. Thank you.
Thank you, Yousef, and thank you, Sima, for both of your very tight and engaging presentations. And I think, Yousef, where you left off is a great segue into talking about the interrelated relationship and the entanglement that I'd like to discuss with both of you, but I would like to start with Sima. What comes to mind often is, why care about Iran? Why care about the sanctions, right? Why now, right? And how is that relatable to what is happening locally, right? So this is a question that I've been asked, you've been asked, we've been asked for many years. I was faced with that question when I first started, when I first came to the US and the first Gulf War started, and I came as a refugee and the first Gulf War started. And, people didn't care what was happening in Iraq. Why is this relatable? So I'd like to discuss that. And I would like to discuss that, not just why Iran now and why the sanctions now, but how is it interrelated to one, what Yousef was talking about, kind of neoliberal logic and the crisis of capitalism and US imperial interests in the region, right? Which breaks down to, if we're going to focus in the region, Iraq and Iran relationship specifically, right? And maybe just a little historical, which Sima, you did already kind of situate this in a historical context. But I'd like to talk about the Iran-Iraq war as well, if you don't mind expanding on that, because I think it's important to realize what's the sanctions on Iran today and the military presence in Iraq today, right, is not something new, right? This is, there are many different moments in our collective history of how we got here. So let's go back to where you started, 1955, with Mossadegh and nationalization of oil, and the revolution and the beginning of the Iraq-Iran war, right? So back in 1980, beginning of the Iraq-Iran war, we know that the United States was directly involved in supporting Saddam and selling both intelligence and weapons to Iraq, and at the same time Iran. And we know about the Iran-Contra affair. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. So 9 years of war that left over 1 million Iraqis and Iranians dead, right? So what does that mean? Why was the United States involved obviously you started in 1950, but if we were going to just talk a little bit about that, but then start really at the Iraq-Iran war, because I think that's a critical point to start to realize how we got here today. So 9 years between Iran and Iraq, that the United States was supporting both countries in this fight where 1 million people died, including selling of chemical weapons. Then the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, and the destruction of Iraq, right? As well as regionally, the destruction of places like Libya, Syria, and how Iran has become the last frontier in many ways, and how Iraq was, before the 2003 invasion and occupation, what we refer to as the 13-year sanctions, right? The United States, even though in 1990, after the first Gulf War, the sanctions were imposed by the UN, later it was really promoted and instigated by the United States. And we know that the sanctions did not affect the Iraqi government at all. It actually strengthened it while weakening the population. And like you said, over 500,000 children died directly because of the sanctions. And there's estimate of over 1 million people actually died. Anyway, so the point is, so in sanctions, basically the effects of the sanctions in the case of Iraq for 13 years, we know were not successful other than strengthening the government, where it led to the invasion. right? So a lot of people talk, many people talk about, well, maybe this was actually part of the plan, that, the United States was interested in weakening the Iraqi state to a point where they can actually invade. So anyways, the point is, how is the sanctions today, and as we know, it's affecting not the government, but rather affecting the most marginalized of Iranian society. So that's the micro, but also in the micro, I think breaking down what does sanctions mean? What does it exactly mean? For example, in the during the Iraq sanctions for 13 years, we know that a lot of people didn't know what actually sanctions meant. A lot of people had didn't understand how it actually translates on a daily basis, right? So things like pencils, right? Because there's lead in pencils. Baby formula cannot be imported because there's something in baby formula, I can't remember right now, something in baby formula that could be extracted, and so on and so forth. So these minute micro effects. And you did mention your involvement with, I believe, your family in Iran in regards to the COVID, right? So maybe you can talk about a little bit about that and the work you're doing directly with them, including the T-shirts campaign and so on. I'll pass it on to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dina. That was a lot, so I'll try to get to as much as I can there. So you started by asking why should we care about the sanctions on Iran and why now? So the question of why now is that, well, it's not just now. I mean, many people have been fighting against the sanctions for decades now, so it's not new. At this particular point, exactly because of the pandemic and exactly because of the effects of sanctions over, these, in particular, I would say in the past decade, with the tightening of sanctions since 2010 and all that, the economic situation in Iran has deteriorated to the point that, like I said, people cannot make the ends meet, right? We have a lot of people, you have, during the pandemic, people just like the US pretty much who have to go to work, right? So you have people who are on the streets working because they basically cannot afford not to. So the question of why Iran matters, and you said kind of the last frontier, for lack of a better word, I think it's exactly because of the US geopolitical interest and the US empire building project that Yousef very nicely explained in his talk. And I think it's important to think about Iran's role in the region, right? So in a sense, both because of the oil production, like I said, even from 1950s, right? It was the Saudi oil production. That Saudi is kind of like the gauge there, right? That works this Saudi, Israel, US kind of triangle that controls the kind of economic the economic situation in the region and worldwide, I would say. So one aspect of it is the, of course, political economic aspect of it, the role of Iran, and like you said, you have now Afghanistan occupied, Iraq occupation happened. You have basically Central Asia that have become, after the fall of the Soviet allies to the U.S. So Iran kind of is the abnormal, as Yousef said. This has become this kind of the threat, and they use actually the language of threat when imposing in many of the bills that I mentioned. Iran has been positioned as a threat to the so-called international community, to our way of life, and so on and so forth. So the production of Iran as a terrorist state discursively has justified this. And that is, again, like I said, for political economic reasons, and because of Iran's geopolitical role in the region, whether you think about the role that Iran has in Iraq, the role Iran has in Lebanon, the role Iran has in Palestine, in particular Palestine. That is why US lobby is so adamant about tightening the sanctions or even war on Iran. We just saw that APEC even got Ilhan Omar, Representative Ilhan Omar, to sign on to the arms embargo on Iran, right? I am personally against militarization, so I am against militarization anywhere, but when we are talking about arms embargo on Iran, when actually Israel is the state that has active nuclear weapons and has not signed on to NPT, then it raises the question of why is that Israel is not subjected to sanctions or embargoes, but Iran is. And those all go back to what Yousef was talking about, of course, creating Iran as an exception, right? And so that is basically, I think, what we need to take into consideration in our analysis when people talk about, well, but what about the repressive Iranian state and so on and so forth? Yes, we need to acknowledge that, but at the same time, we cannot forget that we are dealing with an empire here, right? We are thinking about, we are talking about very uneven geopolitical relationships here. And so we cannot equate Iran as a state, kind of like the way that international relations thinks of states as a family of nations, as if they're all on the similar or equal kind of ground, and considering them as sovereign nations. The reality of it is that we are actually thinking about, we are talking about an empire here, right? An empire that is actively killing people in the name of rights. And that is basically how these days the US is working, right? In the name of liberalization of whether it's economy, and the assumption is that if you liberalize the economy, freedom will roll in automatically. And that's basically the neoliberal logic, right, that Yousef was talking about. So it is through these notions of human rights, through notions of, holding Iran accountable for, I don't know, you don't, as someone who follows the kind of discussions about queerness, every time Iran is accused of violating the rights of queer people, right? It has become kind of what, Gayatri Spivak said, saving brown women from brown men is kind of saving brown queers from the Iranian state, in a sense. So these all become excuses for US military intervention and US sanctions on Iran. So the question of why Iran is important, like I said, Strait of Hormuz, where 1/3 of the oil that kind of is transported through the sea goes through there, and that is why Iran geopolitically is important for political economic reasons. The question that you asked, whether sanctions were successful or not in Iraq, depends on how you define success, right? I would say they were successful for the US because they pushed people to the point of devastation. Zainab Saleh, my colleague, writes about how many Iraqi people, not just people who, not working class people, but middle class people who basically had reached a point of saying, I just either kill me or, end this, in a sense. So people in Iran are getting to that point too, that basically people deal with humor about it, but you see, people making jokes of eggplants falling from the sky, kind of what is next, right? You have sanctions happening, you have COVID-19 happening, you have the airplane that was shut down after Soleimani's assassination, assassination. So it is this position where Iranian people are pushed to the point, and exactly like I said, because during the sanctions, the notions of national security are on the rise, and repression, just like under Saddam Hussein, if you know more than anybody else, between repression and the economic situation, people get to the point that basically US uses that opportunity through strategies of also divide and conquer to justify a military intervention. So this is kind of sanctions kind of are the preparation of a military intervention, in my view, and are a form of war. Sanctions are war in another name. I, um, I don't want to take much time, but I want to talk a little bit later about notions of national security in the US and the question of disaster capitalism and the notion of militarization and why it connects to our lives here. But I'll stop here and hopefully if there's time, I'll address those issues later.
So much, Sima, for that. I want to pivot quickly to Yousef, and as we are really listening to your presentations and taking in ways for us to reassess our strategies right now against sanctions, both in particular with us situated right here in the United States, there's been a lot of questions around how is it that we are to understand this pandemic, this crisis, and its impact in globally, but also in our region. I know, Yousef, you spoke about this crisis and the ways in which it's brought different contradictions to surface. If you could speak a little bit more about the contradictions of militarism, capitalism, neoliberalism, in this global crisis, and the way in which we know the world is actually being shaped as we are watching it being shaped by this pandemic. What are some important things for us to take into account as we are coming up with strategies, whether it's writing petitions or figuring out our targets and understanding where we want to put our energy, understanding also basing it on Sima's response that, it's been Iran, it's not a new thing, right? But then how do we understand that more directly for this moment under this pandemic? What are the main key takeaways you would offer us in terms of understanding specifically the United States policy economically, militarily, and politically in our region? That includes Saudi Arabia, Israel, what's happening in Palestine, Yemen, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. So I'll hand it over to you for a second.
Thank you. That's a lot. So let me say, let me first respond by trying to understand. So if we're trying to figure out, okay, what's the connection of neoliberalism to COVID-19? Let me lay out what I think neoliberalism is. So it's not some kind of just a term. For me, neoliberalism, and I think COVID-19 is truly then showing neoliberalism for the dystopian idea that it is. Neoliberalism is a goal, is a means to a goal, and it's an ethos, it's a way of life. We usually understand neoliberalism by understanding the means, and its means it's a set of policies set around deregulation and privatization, the integration of financial markets all across the world, the opening up of borders to capital and commodities, while at the same time reinforcing those borders for labor so you could flexibilize and cheapen the wages of labor all across the world. In other words, the policy package of neoliberalism is about expanding the private sector and cannibalizing and colonizing the public sector so that there is less and less public. All there is private sphere. That's the means. The goal that it is attempting to achieve for neoliberalism is a world that is governed by the marketplace, protected by governments. And this is important because it's basically the subordination of the state to the rule of the marketplace. And I'll come back to that. And the third is that neoliberalism is an ethos. It's a metaphor for life itself. So that it tells us, every single person, that you should think of yourself as a small corporation, as an economic actor. So this is why, for example, one day if I am not being very productive, I feel very crappy about myself. If I'm not being efficient, I feel very sad. Efficiency and productivity is the language of the assembly line, is the language of the corporation, not the language of happiness or not the language of what I do. The neoliberalism says that the reason why you should relate to other people, in my campus and all schools, where the talk is of entrepreneurship and of creating, what is it? A social network. So you should get to know people because you need to create a social network, not because you should know people because you want to be friends with them, because the understanding of what another person's humanity could better help you develop your own humanity yourself. It's you are no longer, as Wendy Brown says, you are no longer a Homo sapien, you are simply Homo economicus. I think Foucault said it too or something. But you're simply an economic actor. And so you could really see that in COVID-19, right? That today, the way we understand ourselves and want to respond is not by saying, where are people at? How are people doing? Are people sick? Are they anxious? Are they worried? We ask, how's the economy doing? Is the economy good? What do we need to do to make the economy work? It's the subordination of life to the marketplace. The thing that I create as a human being, which is the economy, becomes more important than me, myself, the human being. That is neoliberalism, and that is the thing that the United States since the 1970s has attempted to usher in, not only the United States, this is a global project, but the United States has been fundamental in attempting to push institutions across the world it's attempted to kind of restructure economies all over the world to integrate them into global flows of capital and commodities. And this was in a direct response to the third world moment, at least in the Middle East, the world of that you saw the movements that gave you at some point Nasser and Mossadegh and Qasim in Iraq and others, the world in which we attempted to create a different set of economic relations, a reorienting away from the dependency on colonial economies to a different type of world. And that unfortunately, that world-making project of the colonized peoples was interrupted by the counterinsurgency that neoliberalism was. And I think we are, if we weren't able to see it before, we ought to be able to see it now. And so that brings us to what the US project currently is under under this crisis of COVID-19, which is at all costs attempting to exacerbate or reinforce that notion that the economy is more important than you, that 3,000 people dying every day is okay, is a price we are willing to take, even though it's important to remember that after September 11th, because of close to 4,000 people dying in one day, the United States was decimated a country in Afghanistan, and thereafter decimated Iraq, and then started the war on terror, which has meant that there are countries in the world that for the next 100 years will not be able to recover for 4,000 people. And now 4,000 people, that's, it's okay for a price to pay so your barbershop could open, because the economy is more important than your life. So you could see the kind of the discrepancies and the contradictions and the forked tongue of neoliberalism, as Maya Mikdashi calls it. So then the last thing I'll say about this in terms of what this means for us is that at the same time that as neoliberalism has created this kind of a globally integrated economy, it has also meant that prior to COVID-19, we lived in a world in which it has never been true as much before as it was then, that what I do and my life is intimately related to the life of somebody else living very, very far away from me. It's not a metaphor. It's not an allegory or me waxing poetics. It's literally built into the very global commodity chains of everything that we have, so that you can't really understand yourself without being able to understand somebody else. And the tools and the tactics that are being used elsewhere are being used over here. Look, the same policies that were imposed on Iraq after the US invasion of Iraq, which was of a brutal neoliberal logic in which you had to completely gut the public sector and turn it into a private sector economy. The same thing that happened in Iraq, literally the same type of policies, happened in Detroit after the 2008 financial crisis. It was the same budgetary strategy used in California, and the same type of logic and the same type of talking points. The only difference was in Iraq, you used guns and banks, guns, and here in Detroit, you use the financial sector. So that the interconnectedness that we need to be, is no longer just kind of, again, a metaphor. It's the real. And I think then, given what with COVID-19, you're able then to see how deeply connected we are. I mean, other than the fact that part of the expansion of the accumulation logic of capital has meant that we are more and more intervening and into the environment, which has meant that new viruses are emerging and new kinds of pandemics are more common. We are able to see then how quickly these kinds of issues cross borders. And so then we need to step up our own game by making sure that our politics is one of transnational solidarity, and one that understands that there is no artificial barrier in our logic between what goes on over there and what goes on over here. And this is not a question, like I said, of tactics. I'm not an ally to the Black community because somehow my alliance with the Black community will mean that they're going to come and support me when I'm down and I'm support them when I'm down. It's not a question of strategy of increasing our numbers so we can have more people show up to our events or to our rallies. It's internally related. We are talking about the same problem. The only difference is a matter of degrees, maybe, of how much victimized we are at any given point in time by those very problems.
Thank you so much, Yousef, and thank you, Sima. There's been a lot of questions about strategy, action, and I know you all did such a beautiful job of laying out not just the parallels and connections between struggles, but really the ways in which they are one and the same, right? And it's not transactional. And so, while we understand now, and I hope all our audience has a clearer picture of the ways in which the sanctions on Iran are in fact connected to so many other struggles around the world, but also right here in the United States, if you all could leave us with some concrete examples of strategies, actions people could take to act in solidarity, against economic warfare in Iran, but also globally. So what are some examples that you could leave our audience with for them to be able to really put into practice some of the lessons that they've learned from you all today, and hopefully wage some struggles to advance changes for the betterment of not only the people of Iran, but the entire global South. So why don't we start with Sima? I know, for instance, there was a statement that was put out by a group of feminists in New York that was an anti-militarization statement that listed several countries that are impacted by sanctions, and the ways in which we need to understand the interconnectedness there, but also centralize anti-militarism in our work today. So if you could speak to that for a few minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Laura. Yes, as Yousef explained very clearly, this is not just a question of separate issues, but we are talking about kind of a relational approach where we see how the neoliberal policies that have been implemented around the world, starting with Latin America and, in the Middle East and in the US, are very much connected to each other. And thinking about such policies, then we can think about the cuts in welfare, as I said when I was reading the poem in the beginning, cuts in education, in social services, and all of that in the US are really about basically the shrinking of the state, yet expanding the military apparatus of the state, because as Yousef said, it's the job of the governments to also protect the market. And that is why we see so much of the budget in the US is going to militarization, right? The US spends $900 billion on militarization, and only $7 billion on CDC, right? That is why we see this crisis that we see with COVID-19 now, that there are 70-something thousand people dying in the US because of lack of access to universal healthcare, because of the emphasis or the misplaced emphasis on national security. That we have to think or rethink the way that we consider national security, whether that means about prisons or militarization, or that means actually education, whether that security comes with education and healthcare and so on and so forth. So, and we can think about of the US military support of settler colonial states such as Israel or India in Kashmir, right? So we need to make these connections and see how settler colonialism here is connected to settler colonialism there, how basically the criminalization of communities of color and immigrants here are very much connected to the forms of demonization of Muslims in the Middle East or in Kashmir, right? Or in India, in Shaheen Bagh. So we need to make these connections and connect our movements. So we need to support Shaheen Bagh, or we need to support Kashmir or Palestine, not as separate issues from what's going on in the US, because these issues, as Yousef explained very clearly, are interconnected. And I just wanted to also say his name, other than Ahmed Arbery, Sean Reed, another young man in Indianapolis who on Wednesday was killed by the police, shot 12 times, I believe. We need to think about how is that the police state in the US, how is that the repression of Black Lives Matter or in Standing Rock, and the forms of spending that the militarization of the police in the US is connected and is packaged at the same time in the name of humanitarianism elsewhere, right? So we basically see the US military going in the name of or NATO, not just the US military, in the name of humanitarian work in times of crisis, and how also these moments are moments that actually lead to disaster capitalism. We saw that in Haiti happen, right? We saw how the industrial park that the Clintons pretty much built in Haiti was in the aftermath of the earthquake and a form of kind of disaster capitalism. And just recently I read that they opened, despite that these sweatshops in the industrial park in Haiti are very much crammed and crowded, they opened so that the women, Haitian women, start making PPEs, personal protection equipments, that are then sent to the US, right? So we are actually, so the lives of Black people in Haiti become disposable, and we need to make that connection to how then Black lives here become disposable, and how lives of Muslims and how lives of Iranians, Palestinians, Kashmiris, Iraqis, Afghanis become disposable. The statement that you mentioned, Laura, is one of the examples of transnational feminist solidarity. Of course, as Dina said, this work has been done in the past, so it's not new. But this is one example that just a few months ago, a group of us, 23 people, women and gender non-conforming people, got together and wrote a statement. I believe that Yousef has posted the link. It's called the Statement for Feminist Foreign Policy to Confront the Coronavirus Pandemic. And it was basically the organizers were Madre, Women Cross DMZ, and Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, where people, indigenous people from Korea, talking about the sanctions on Korea, Palestinians, Egyptian Americans. So we had a large group, Black women, Latinas, got together to write this statement, which makes the exact connections that we have been talking about. thinking about connections of national security here and the spending on militarization to the US empire building projects and to the sanctions in Venezuela, in Iran, in Korea, and in Cuba and other places. We also, in this statement, make connections to the US intervention in Latin America and basically the way that the kind of the coups that US backs in, for example, Honduras, give rise to the kind of violence that pushes people, produces refugees, and then we have the so-called crisis at the border when people are put in camps and subjected to inhumane conditions, separation of immigrant children from their parents at the borders. So these are the connections that we need to make, and that, of course, the border policing has to do with rising militarization and securitization of the borders. So that is, one example. Of course, we can make those also connections between academic and activist work. I don't believe in that sharp binary, so I think many of us are doing that work, and hopefully we can encourage other academics to move out of just strictly academic writing and kind of engage with activist organizations that are doing this work. On my campus, for example, we are trying to do that with a journal that a collective journal that I'm part of. It's called Agitate, Unsettling Knowledges. We have another group, Imagining Transnational Solidarities, where we are trying to do that kind of work. So I think, and you guys are doing that work in the Bay. So I think these are the forms of solidarities that we need to form, but not just in the US, but connecting to actually struggles elsewhere, right? Connecting to struggles, like I said, in Kashmir, in Palestine, in Iran, in Iraq. Of course, the limitations, for example, in Iran, I know that Iranian women activists a few years ago came up with videos of saying why they're against war and militarization and how that affects women. So we need to also make those connections between gendered effects of militarism and the effect that sanctions have on women. So those are some of the ways that I can think of examples of solidarity and coalition building. Dina, you asked this before, so I'm going to show the t-shirts that I'm wearing as one form of kind of coalition building that we have been doing. No Sanctions on Iran t-shirts. And a group of artists. This is one of the designs, but a group of artists basically donated their art, and the money that we raise, we send to organizations in Iran that are basically working with people who are most affected by the sanctions. And this is our way of kind of moving out of the non-profit industrial complex rather than working through the 501c3 organizations. And exactly because the sanctions and OFAC doesn't allow any kind of support to Iran, but we are trying to come up with creative ways of raising funds ourselves that goes outside of the logic of charity and works through the logic of solidarity, and trying to help organizations in Iran that are doing that kind of grassroots work. Bunyad Imam Ali, for example, Imam Ali Society is one organization, and also doing a campaign, a billboard campaign that we were about to do and got some funding from different, little organizations here and individuals or allies. But then this whole quarantine happened, and we can't really have street banners, or what do you call it, billboards yet, but hopefully that will happen. So these are some of the things that we are doing, and I think these are creative ways that we can kind of connect our small efforts together to make it a kind of a ripple effect of making it a kind of a larger and transnational form of coalition building.
Thank you, Sima. If you can put the link to where to buy those t-shirts, a lot of people have been asking, and I think it's that Facebook page. If you can go ahead and put it in the chat box, and I know that we'll send a follow-up email from the Center of Political Education that'll include some of these resources. Yousef, I just wanted to hand it to you for any final thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, so I'll try to answer the same question that you posed, and I'll just build, because I agree with everything that Sima just laid out brilliantly. I want to thank all the people that are listening to us and are watching us and are asking all these questions. And I apologize from my perspective if I wasn't able to clarify some things and be able to respond to all of your questions. You know, I teach at a university, and unfortunately, there's a fetishization these days of online education, and online education replacing physical education. And I think one thing we've learned from this crisis, this pandemic, is that no amount of technology could make up for the intimacy and shared humanity created by our physical presence together. And so I wish I was there with you, and then we could hang out after in the parking lot and talk about this. So thank you for listening to me, and for listening to all of us and the questions. So my apologies for not being able to answer everything. And in response to kind of like what things we could do in terms of resistance, there's a lot to do, and I think a lot of the people listening and part of the organizations that sponsored this event are doing some of that work, and I think they are probably more apt at answering them. But I would just say, from my perspective, one, that anti-imperialism is important. It's not a thing that we argue about after we figure out what our positions are and what our policies are, but rather anti-imperialism should be a point of departure. It should be the basic starting point, and that it's a first step, because it first reminds us of our commonality, and it reminds us of how we are being interpolated by the very system that is victimizing us. It reminds us that our differences, which are racialized differences, is a construction by an enemy that is trying to extract every ounce of us to generate capital before discarding us to the wayside. So it's a first step, and it needs to, and we need to bring it back into our conversations. And the second, for all of us here in the United States or in Europe, so this is not so much, I have nothing really to say to people in Iran or people in Iraq or people in Lebanon or elsewhere. I think they're doing the work that they need to be doing in those places. We've seen that and across the world. But for us in the United States and in Europe, when the US talks about foreign policy and war, we need to start not looking over there first and start looking over here. We shouldn't look at Tehran and Baghdad and Beirut, but we should look at Washington, D.C. to see what are the faults over here that make wars over there such an important and necessary objective. And part of that means that we need to start insisting about our humanity, and to start realizing how ridiculous it is that we need to insist on our humanity first, that we are more than our work, we are more than our labor, that our life is more important than our jobs, that we are more important than the economy, that we come first. We become first before the things that we produce. And that is a problem that is fundamental in the United States. We could solve that in the United States. We need not do something over there. We could do that over here. And that means maybe we might need to start venturing outside of the political constraints that are given to us, and the narrow, myopic political process that keeps disciplining us. And to start thinking about something that is more than at best mediocrity, and at worst 21st century fascism, which is the only thing that the political process in the United States so far has been able and capable of giving us. And third, and the last thing, is that the future is not foretold, and the future is not some break from today. That the past affects us, that the past lives within all of us still, that the present is made of the past, and the future is already here. It's not some absolute break from the present. That the future is here in the work that I think Sima was talking about, that her and her colleagues and her comrades are doing, and the work that the organization sponsoring this event are doing. The future is already here in the sacrifices that you see people making every single day, whether those are doctors, nurses, and caregivers, or the Instacart driver who delivers me my food so I could be safe. That the sacrifices, because don't get it twisted, that the delivery person, the postal, the post person who delivers our mail, the people who are delivering our food, it's not simply about money that they're making. They see it as this is their way of helping us. This is the sacrifices that they're making. So that what I'm saying is that the future we want to build is already here, and you already see it. But you see it in these different localities. How do we make that the generalized condition? How do we build the structures that create the conditions in which that becomes the normal response, as opposed to the rugged dystopian individualism that the current system fosters? So that, and I think with that, that also means that we must put forward, I think, a new narrative. We must dispossess ourselves and proclaim our independence from nationalism and nation state. And we must put forward a new narrative and embrace an internationalism, and embrace a globality that is not rooted in our shared identity, but rather in a shared struggle and a commitment to dream together. That it's very clear this world is a dying world, it is a sick world, and we need to build a new world. And this new world cannot be built on the same old sick and diseased narratives and institutions of this world.
Thank you so much. And with those words, we're going to wrap up. I want to thank Yousef and Sima and Dina for participating and bringing such an important contribution to the conversation of sanctions on Iran today. I want to also apologize to those of you who weren't able to get to your questions. This was one of the liveliest discussions and chats that we've had since we started these forums, and we tried to weave in as many as we could, and there'll be more time to do so next week. We will be well, first, I just want to remind everybody to follow the different partner organizations on Twitter and social media. You can follow AROC, the Red Nation, and Center for Political Education. You see the handles right here. And also that we are continuing this series. We have 3 more as part of this forum. Next week is Palestine and the blockade on Gaza. Following that is China and US relations. And then on May 29th, Abolition and the COVID crisis. So we hope you will all join us and look out for the recording. Thank you again for participating in this Friday night forum.